Start. If everybody except our speaker can mute themselves and me. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Anna Ciaunica. I'm actually not sure how to pronounce your last name.
I didn't say hello, Alia.
Nice. So Anna completed her PhD on physicalism and qualia at the University of Burgundy in France, after which she did postdocs both at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland and at UCL, investigating the link between sense of self, embodiment, and social connectedness in several psychological conditions. And she's currently working as a PI at both the Institute of Philosophy in Porto and at the ICN here in London, investigating sense of self and embodiment using a combination of philosophical approaches as well as experimental psychology. And today she will tell us about the bodily roots of conscious experience in early life. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for having me. So I think since the last time I gave you my bio, things have changed a bit. So now I moved from Porto to Lisbon. So I'm based at the Center for Philosophy of Science, Faculty of Science, University of Lisbon. I just started in September. So I'm starting here my own lab, so to speak. And the title of the lab is the Co-Embodied Self Lab. And I hope I'm going to convince you why I decided to have this name, because it's very much related basically with the title of the talk. So thank you so much for being here, all of you. So let me see, how can I, okay. So first I want to start by saying that this is just not my work. This is a teamwork. And this is, I'm going to present a paper that I co-authored with Adam Saffron and Jonathan Delafield-Butt. And it was a part of the special issue edited by Neuroscience of Consciousness journal. And they had this like special issue on consciousness, science, and its theories. And our paper decided, in our paper, we decided to be a bit radical about it. And I said, okay, so let's start from scratch, go back to the square one and look at the bodily roots of conscious experiences, really how they unfold. So basically, our starting question was like, not what consciousness is, but how consciousness emerges and how arises. So I said, well, let's change a bit the topic. And then, I mean, not the topic, but the approach, the entrance point. But before I start, I want to give you a very, very, very few lines about myself. So I'm trained as a philosopher, as an analytic philosopher, but I also did some work on phenomenology and cognitive science. And even though I started my career like sort of like hardcore analytic philosopher, I did my thesis on physicalism and qualia, on mind-body problem. I slowly but surely migrated towards more like empirical-based research. I want to do like things hands-on, doing like gathering data, doing science, collaborating with scientists. And while doing this, I spent some time there with you, with your institution in London at UCL, the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. And for a while, I was doing like a project there as a PI with Harry Farmer as co-PI on altered sense of self. And basically, I was a bit like the philosopher in residence. And my task there was to ask a philosophical annoying question to a scientist. And I was like, what do you mean by social? So what do you mean by perception? Yeah, this type of things that scientists were like, and one of my favorite annoying question was like, okay, so if you have a conference or like a gathering like this one, like scientific event, you look around, you see just adults around us, right? So why don't we have like kids or, toddlers or children actually, doing science? And when I asked this question, my colleagues, scientists and psychologists, they looked at each other, at IC, and I said, well, I told you not to get a philosopher with us because they ask this type of question, right? It's just like, what do you mean? It's like, obviously, it's like we are doing science as adults. But if you look carefully at this question, actually is far from trivial, because the idea here is that when we ask certain question about what is perception, what is social, or social interaction, we basically may have built in a sort of adult-centric bias. So the way we address the question, we look at the question, is maybe already kind of like framed in a certain way that takes the full-fledged individual as an entrance point. But we humans, we don't, naturally, we don't develop like this. I mean, we don't arise fully-fledged like Athena's from Zeus' head. So we have a developmental story. So we have a path that get us actually where we are right now. So this means that maybe we need to modify a bit the entrance point to actually ask certain question. Maybe we get different answers, right? So that was like the entrance point. And why is this important? So for instance, like if you are a mathematician or a scientist, and you want to build a model, let's say, of a living creature like a plant or a human, yeah. And if you take just like the full-fledged starting point, then you realize, well, you might be very tempted to actually take the properties of that full-fledged entity, like the plant or the human, and just squeeze it and make it like minimal. Yeah. So for instance, there's a lot of discussion, what is minimal self, what is minimal self-consciousness. So it might be tempting to basically take some properties that we found in adult full-fledged and just like diminish them, squeeze them and say, well, that's a minimal basis. But that's tricky. And I think that's problematic, because if you look in nature, then you realize how things develop, then you can see that basically the property of the plant here, at the adult, so to speak, stage are not the same, and the shape is not the same as the starting point, and the same with humans. So this means if you want to understand how this thing is, like the structure of this entity, we need to take basically the entire trajectory into account in a kind of like unfolding dynamic way. And that's our approach for the problem of consciousness I'm going to present today. And we start with this observation, basically, that when we take, as a philosopher, I did a lot of work on physicalism and qualia, and I spent a lot of time arguing about that there was something special about seeing red or ripe tomatoes, what the red is, reddishness, redness, all those kind of like properties, and it was quite interesting. I'm not saying this, but it's like vision and conscious experiences are just one part of our conscious experiences, one way to basically access in the world, and it's not necessarily the most fundamental one. It is obviously the most well-known, but not necessarily, the basic one. And we start with this observation that, Graziano notes that many scientists who study consciousness focus on microscoping problem, a person looking at a small round spot on a screen, and then, detecting it and say, oh, I see it, or I didn't see it. And that's kind of like counts as, an indicator of the perception is conscious. And as I said, it's like many discussions, especially in philosophy, about the features, the fundamental feature of conscious experience, namely the qualitative character or the phenomenal character of an experience, the famous what is this likeness of an experience, and the subjectivity, namely what it is like for me, the for me-ness of an experience. They usually framed again with examples from vision, seeing colors or objects. And this bias runs very deep in correct consciousness studies, and they characterize even the distinction between conscious versus unconscious perception. So for instance, if you have subliminal perception is inferred when a stimulus is demonstrated to be invisible while still influencing thoughts, feelings, actions, learning, or memory. Yeah. So, and also it is primarily via the demonstration of semantic activation from invisible stimuli that researchers try to define the limits of non-conscious perception. And again, we look at, semantic processes, which again, is very much related with the full-fledged adult understanding of like words and language processing. However, our sensory experiences or conscious awareness on daily life is not just about vision. We have a cocktail of multisensory, experiences. We hear things, we feel things, we touch things, we smell things. And there is some early work tackling, for instance, like tactile detection in auditory modality. And I would like to stress there is some very nice recent work by People like Anat Arzi, they look at the relationship between conscious experience and olfaction. And I think this is brilliant, and highly encourage you to look at this work, because olfaction is very important. We realize it, for instance, right now with the COVID, that many people lost the sense of smell, and by losing the sense of smell, they significantly lost also the sense of like reality, and they also had a diminished sense of self and sense of presence in the world. So that's something important and interesting. And our radical take, it's a bit provocative, but it's provocative on purpose. So one want to say, well, there is no such a thing as consciousness. And by thing, we mean here, like, well, an object there in the world, right? We build upon, and this is the philosophy part. So follow me, bear with me. So we start with this idea that consciousness is intrinsically linked to experiences. So you cannot have like consciousness without somehow have experience built in. Yeah. So we talk about consciousness because it's easy, but can be misleading. We need to talk correctly about conscious experiences. Then, what are experiences? Experiences are particular spatial temporal events that consist in the instantiation of experiential properties by experiencing subjects. So again, if consciousness is not floating in the air, but they are linked to experiences in turn, they're not floating in the air either. They kind of like linked to a certain particular spatial temporal individuals. In our case, humans. Yeah. So this means that experiences do not occur in vacuum, but they are intrinsically linked to an experiencing subject or to someone, which is the ontological bearer. That's the, let's say, the word in philosophy, a geeky word for this. And I like this quote by Martin Rummelin. So I did some work with Martin in Switzerland during my first postdoc. And she has this very beautiful idea that we cannot even think of the occurrence of experience without thereby thinking of as involving an experiencing subject. Yeah. So you follow me. Consciousness, experience, experiencing subject. Yeah. So that's kind of like a necessary link. Hence, the notion of experiencing subject is conceptually prior to the notion of an experience, and the notion of experience is conceptually prior to the notion of consciousness. So that's the starting point. Now, so I build upon this existing body of work. This is something that has been already done. So if this is so, then before any attempt to understand consciousness, we really must address the nature of experiencing subjects. Yeah, and this emphasis is far from being trivial because, as it happens, the someone or the bearer of experiences in human case, as I said, is not an abstract entity floating in an abstract space, but rather humans and the experiencing subject at stake here are embodied living organisms actively engaging with the wider and physical and social environment in order to secure survival and self-preservation and potential reproduction. So for instance, right now you are listening to me, but you may consider yourself like, individual in a room, isolated, you don't interact with other people, but right now you are breathing. Yeah. So you take elements from the outside world that you need in order to survive. You cannot survive without breathing. So you are an open system constantly exchanging with the environment to actually maintain that self-preservation and, later on, conscious experiences. Yeah. Now, if consciousness cannot be addressed in isolation from experiences, then the latter cannot be addressed in isolation from experiences subject, which in turn cannot be isolated from the body and the closest environment. So that's the starting point, what we want to say. Now, I want to go a step further. Say, okay, if that's the case, let's look, what is the closest environment of an emerging human being? Yeah. So, because as I said, we don't arise in the world like full-fledged appear from the Zeus head. So we arise basically within another human body. And we want to say that the most primitive and closest environment of the developing human body is another human body. Hence, the most basic perceptual experiences, what we call the first prior, may arise already in womb. That is when humans share bodily and organismic resources with another human being. So for instance, when the mother breathes, takes in elements that actually will impact the body inside her body. Yeah. And this is one essential overlooked aspect of current discussion of consciousness and also embodied experiences, is that basically experiencing subjects first develop within another human bodies, hence within another experiencing subject. And this primitive and fundamentally relational co-embodied roots of our experiences may have crucial impact on the way human beings start consciously experiencing both the self, body, and world. And our take here is very much in line with some work that has been developed already by people from Pamela Lyon group. She called the biogenic approach to cognition. And there is this is something that she contrasts with what she calls the anthropogenic approach to cognition, which I would add, also mostly because I know that philosophy has been, male dominated. It's like male adult-centric approach, where basically you assume the human cognition as the paradigm and then work down to a more general explanatory concept. Remember the squeeze image that I put in the beginning? Whereas the biogenic approach actually takes a bottom-up perspective. Starts with the fact of biology, starts with the fact that actually humans are animals, just like other animals, like mammals. And biology needs to be the basis for theorizing, and works up to the human case by asking psychological questions as if they were basically biological questions. Yeah. And before I go further, I need another conceptual distinction from philosophy that comes from basically phenomenology. And in phenomenology, people distinguish between the self on the I as a subject of an experience, and the self and the I as an object of an experience. So you can have this classic example. I can see myself in the mirror, and I can see myself in the mirror as an object of other people's gaze. Yeah, but that's very different from basically actually being myself, the subject of an experience we're here and now. And Wittgenstein has a very nice example about this. He says something like, I'm not sure it's precisely his example, but along the same line, he says something. Imagine you say something, I'm in pain or I'm falling. Yeah. I can be wrong about the fact that I'm falling. Let's say I'm not falling, but I'm having the dream that I'm falling, but I'm, in reality, I'm basically, lying safely in my bed. So I can be wrong about the content of that representation, self-related, but I cannot be wrong about the fact that I'm having that. So I'm having that experience. Yeah. Whereas, like, if I look myself in a mirror or in a picture of myself and say, oh, I look awesome in this picture, maybe I'm wrong about the I in that picture because, let's say, it's not me, but my twin sister. Yeah. So I can misrepresent the self in the third person, but not in the first experience of one. And this is important because we want to make a claim which is taken from the phenomenology perspective and approach. And basically, we want to say that there is a continuum between what phenomenological tradition calls the pre-reflected sense of self, self-consciousness, and conscious experiences. Yeah, and the idea here would be that this is something that Sartre defended quite nicely. He said, makes no sense basically to talk about conscious experience without necessarily implicitly talking about self-conscious experience. So again, going back what I said in the first slides, remember, it's just like the experiences are necessarily related to experiencing subjects. And as a subject in experience, you have a self-experience, you have a self-consciousness, implicit, pre-reflective. Then later on, you can become aware of yourself as being object of your own awareness. That's reflective consciousness. But you cannot have that one without the implicit one. Yeah. So that's the basic point here. And we came up with this pyramid. I think Adam created at a certain point a tree, which is actually nicer, but I couldn't find it in my emails. But the idea here would be that we basically have a continuum because we have the fundamental basis, which is we share, let's say, with animals, and those are embodied experiences or experiencing subjects. Yeah. And then we go higher up until we get a reflective self-consciousness, where I basically can take myself as an object of my awareness. So for instance, if I look myself in a mirror, or I can become aware of my own breathing. For instance, if I'm doing meditation, I typically don't pay attention to my heartbeats. I typically don't pay attention to my movements or my breathing, but I can, if I want, to take those experiences, subjective experience, as an object of an experience. Now, When I'm sleeping, I'm still breathing. I'm not aware of me breathing, but doesn't mean that actually my body doesn't keep track of the self-related information, which is actually hugely important, highly important for my survival. I need to keep breathing when I sleep, when I lost, let's say, consciousness or awareness in the traditional term. Yeah. So the idea here is that we need to have this like basic pre-reflective level in place from the very beginning. Now, if that's the case, let's go back to the emerging, right? The emerging experiences, how we basically come to perceive and experience ourselves in the world from square one. So when we basically, start the life journey, yeah. And there is growing empirical evidence suggesting that the most basic experiences are already present in the root. So we are very careful here. We say experiences. We don't say anything about consciousness because we consider that basically experiences, embodied experience, are the fundamental level, yeah, the basis, yeah. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to give you too much like empirical evidence because you can just like take the references and go see for yourself, which is fascinating work. So there's work done in singleton pregnancy, but also in twin pregnancy by Zoya and colleagues and Castillo and colleagues. They show that basically fetuses have moved very differently in function of whether they touch themselves, they touch the uterine environment, or they touch the twin siblings. Yeah. And also something very important I would like to stress is that we typically, when we address consciousness in a vision biased way, we have like a person typically isolated and standing and looking at a screen, but in reality, human beings, like biological systems, we cannot survive if we don't move. So movement of the body and kinematics of the body, and with all this changes, sensory changes that this implies, is fundamental for survival. I mean, I can't survive if I'm unable to move, go there and grab some food or a potential partner, yeah, to find one. So movement is really essential, and basically fetuses move from the very beginning. And by movement, I mean not just like the goal direction action that we can have, but also, the movement of your heartbeats and the movement of the body that basically carries you, right? So mothers are moving all the time. And also, and why I'm stressing this, because going back to the embodied experiences, those are not separated or isolated from movement. So we need to talk basically more about sensory motor kind of like experiences, because they both kind of like the two sides of the same coin. Yeah. And there is very nice empirical evidence showing that, already at least starting from 22, 24 weeks of the gestation, we have very nice kinematic trajectory that are differentiating functional, as I said, just like the other interacting other. Yeah. So I think that's important to stress. Now, as I presented the phenomenological view, which is more like the philosophy side, as I said, it's like there is this idea developed by Sartre and other people saying that we cannot talk about consciousness without actually necessarily talking implicitly about self-consciousness. Then this idea is very nicely echoed with some recent trends in mind and brain research that stipulate that self-preservation, namely the maintenance of one's vital integrity like homeostasis and allostasis, is at the core of all our perceptual events. So this means that the self is not just embodied, but also perceptual experiences are imperatively driven by the basic constraints of physiological regulation that subserve self-preservation of the embodied human individual. So the idea here is that, well, as I said, you cannot really survive and do philosophy without breathing. So we share this with animals, the idea that, well, we need to keep track of this organism, make sure this survives. And whether we like it or not, whenever we perceive something, self-related interests like self-related information comes somehow smuggled in and necessarily guide both our perception and action. And this is a recent trend developed by people like Notov, like Alfriston, and Seth, Zacharias, myself, and Katerina Kotopoulou. We worked on this. So there is this idea that, well, if you take seriously the idea of experiencing subject, and then from experiencing subject go down to embodiment, then embodiment is something we share with other mammals, then we necessarily have the self-preservation, so to speak, like built in. And I know it's a bit like strong example, but I think for me, its most striking example is I'm giving all the time is the example of like suicide. Yeah. So for instance, if I decide to kill myself, I cannot do that by just saying to my cells, stop functioning. Even if my metacognitively I can take a pill or something, end my body, I mean the self-related, animal, the self-centered animal will fight for myself against myself until the very last drop of blood. Yeah. So there's this idea that there's this drive to self-preservation, which is really, really important. And this is something we developed. So we took the influential predictive processing paradigm, and we tried to apply it to the case of like the first prior, the co-embodiment and co-homeostasis in early life. And I'm aware that there is a debate where it's like, predictive processing or active inference is kind of like one size fits all and kind of explains everything, hence nothing. So there is a debate there. I want to stay out from that debate for now. All I want to say is just, I think there is at least one idea which is highly convincing for me, is this idea that, well, we are not just like passive receivers of whatever information comes from the world, but actually our brain actively anticipates what information is coming next based on our prior experiences. So basically what we see is what we expect to see based on our prior experiences. If that's the case, it's very important to bear in mind that actually our first experiences are necessarily, the thing we are cared most about is the self, right? So the self-related information processing is kind of like the core of our experiences. So we need to have that bridge, that entrance point into the reality. Hence, as Sartre said, without being aware of the predictive processing at that time, but this idea that, well, we cannot have a conscious experience without necessarily smuggling in self-conscious experience. Yeah. And in this paper, we basically take two branches of like thinking, like theoretical approaches. One is coming from the embodied cognition. So this idea that cognition is enactment of a world and a mind on the basis of history of variety of action that being in the world performs. So it's not a snapshot of like time t now. It's just like something that needs to be unfolded through time in a dynamic fashion. So that's on one hand. And the other hand, we have this idea that's developed by predictive processing people that say, well, the human brain actively predicts or anticipates what sensory input is coming next on the basis of prior inputs. Yeah. So let's say that it's like fairly uncontroversial, this idea that our ongoing perception, cognitive processes, and actions are somehow influenced by prior events and experiences. Now, we want to take this idea a step further. So if this is true, but this is very important, right? So if it's true that whatever we experience now has been influenced by prior experience, well, we need to really go back to actually score one, how exactly the first prior emerged, right? Because that's going to influence how you're going to perceive and how you're going to experience the world later on, right? You cannot simply just like dismiss it, but you need to actually take a good look at them. Yeah. So as I said, if our ongoing perception, cognition, and action at time t are infused and depending on prior perception inputs and events, it becomes crucial to look at how experience and action get off the ground from the outset. Yeah. And as I said earlier, it's like one basic and yet highly overlooked aspect of embodied and predictive processing approaches in both philosophy and cognitive neuroscience is brains and minds and human bodies first develop within another human body. Yeah. And I want to stress this because typically when I talk about this topic, say, well, or pregnancy is like it's somehow tacitly associated with just a certain type of individuals, namely the individuals that are able to get pregnant. Yeah. But what I want to say is like if you take the other perspective, the perspective of the fetus or the infant or the baby, then you can see that while not all humans will have the experience of being pregnant or carrying a baby, the experience of being carried and growing within another person is universal. We've all been there, yeah? So this means that we need to take it into account as a universal feature of our experiences and not necessarily just relate with a certain category of people, yeah? And again, for the sake of time, I cannot enter into the fascinating details of what exactly is happening between the two bodies when a pregnancy starts successfully. But what I can say is that this myth of like, it's actually really complicated to set up a successful pregnancy. It's a constant negotiation and dialogue between two bodies. Yeah, it's not just like you drop an egg into a basket and that's it. It's not a passive thing. It's really a dialogue between the two bodies, and things can go right, but things can also go wrong. And especially in the first months of weeks of pregnancy, where there's literally a negotiation of common resources, like you give me this, I'm giving that, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, and actually the most miscarriages happen during this first negotiation period. Yeah, and it's important to say that this is an active and bidirectional exchange. Yeah, it's not just from one body to another, but from the other, organism to the mother as well. So there's like the famous case of I think it's Michael Chimera, where basically the person had babies. They basically carry genetic material from the father's way after they basically gave birth. Yeah, so there is a constant dialogue between the two bodies. And because I'm a philosopher and I want to make very clear what I mean by the terms I'm using, I'm going to give you an example. What do I mean by co-embodied and co-agent? Because it's also the title of my lab, so I need to make sure that I get the concepts correctly. And I think the best way to do it just give an example. So follow me with this example, because I think that's important. So what I want to say is like, well, in pregnancy, you have a fundamental case of co-embodiment. This is what I want to say. That's radical. So I want to say, okay, so bodies are actually co-bodies from the start. So this means, in biological terms, this means that the regulation of the two agent states, and particularly the need to maintain the physiological stability despite a fluctuating and unpredictable environment, is actively negotiated between the two organisms that share, for a given amount of time, typically 9 months, common bodily and environmental resources. As I said, it's a negotiation. Now, so I'm going to give you two examples of co-embodiment. Yeah. So the first one is like, take the following example. So you suppose you are a circus performer. Yeah. And in the circus, you have a partner, and your task in the circus performer part of the left and of the trap, so your friend, and then your task is to coordinate your body movements to walk as fast as possible to reach a target, let's say to reach an apple, and you need to walk together to the target. Yeah. Now imagine that I'm stumbling, I walk on a rock or something, and hurt myself and fall. Yeah. So we can say
the pictures are sent by the cities inside. These are the role of cities inside, which they bring mosquito fat.
Sorry, I think I missed.
I think that was an accident. So.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So suppose you need to share the trousers, to a joint common goal. Yeah. And I stumble upon something and I hurt my toes, let's say, and I'm falling. Yeah. So there is a case when I can say that by falling, my friend will fall with me. So we're going to fall together. So we are co-falling. So we have a common event, which is like the co-falling together. Yeah. But is this necessarily so? And the answer is no, because let's assume that, my friend is like a very good yoga teacher, and he has a very good balance. And while I'm falling, he actually managed to keep his balance and he's standing. And there is also a sense in which basically he doesn't share my pain because, well, my toe hurts, but he's kind of amused by me falling and he's laughing. So basically he's like having a different emotional state than mine. Yeah. So it's kind of like disjoint type of like sharing. We could fall together, but not necessarily so. Yeah. But now contrast this case of like shared environment with the case of pregnancy. Yeah. So suppose I'm a pregnant woman who's like, also need to, go and run and, catch the bus or something. Yeah. And if again, I'm stumbling and I'm falling, yeah, then the person, I mean, the other body that I'm carrying in my body cannot say, oh, wait a minute, actually, I don't want to fall. You just, you go ahead, Polly, I'm staying here. Thank you very much. I'm actually quite good here. Yeah. So there is a sense in which basically the two bodies are necessarily linked into the joint spatial temporal event. Yeah. So this means that if I'm going through a negative or a positive emotional state, that will necessarily impact the body that I'm having within my body. Yeah. So here, the key idea between the example 1 and example 2 is that the two agents are co-embodied and strongly coupled together within the boundaries of a shared organismic state, the pregnant state. And that's very important. Yeah. And what are the implications of this idea that we want to defend? Is like, as I said, this idea that the fetus kind of like isolated and trapped within the solitude of the womb, I think that's not correct. That's inaccurate. Basically, the two bodies actively exchange information for better and for worse during that, and actually even after birth, humans necessarily they're highly dependent on the physical contact and physical presence of another human body to regulate their internal states. So that's very important to bear in mind. Second, it is crucial to know that in womb, the most developed sensory system are tactile, auditory, olfactory, and not necessarily visual. So this means that maybe if we take this bottom-up approach of what experience means and what subjective experience means, what embodied experience means, and then later on what self-experience means at the both reflective and pre-reflective level, then we need to look at all sensory modalities, not just vision. Because sound, touch, and smell are the principal modalities of perception of early life. And also, as I said, because we move all the time, the proprioceptive control of movements and body posture. And these are the inputs that actually may provide the fundamental basis upon which all our perceptual experiences are built later in our adult life. So that's work in progress. And now we are doing some other work because we remember the first slide we said we want to zoom out from the classic conundrum of neural correlates of conscious experience. So basically we want to avoid the neurocentric perspective of understanding what experience is and what perception is. And we want to look at other systems and mechanisms within the human body that also are related with the self, or self-perception, self-preservation. And this is work that we are doing with Dr. Anjali Bhatt and Professor Carl Frisson. So basically, we look at the differentiation between self and other immune level. And this is something that Anjali already developed in this brilliant paper. But basically, she looked at immunoperceptive inference, and she brilliantly related with disorders, of, let's say, higher level mental processes and how they are linked to basically disorder at immune responses, right? Because if you remember what I said about the self-preservation, the fact that you need to keep track of the self, then if something goes wrong, so immediately the system that allows you to actually interact with the immune system, then will play a key role in that negotiation, right? So not necessarily just the neural one, but also other systems in the body. And also, as I said, we take this biogenic approach where we basically look very carefully at the human body as a living system. And as I said at the beginning, it's like living system means you are an open system for the better and for worse. So this means that you breathe in oxygen for your survival right now, but in the same time you breathe in some virus that's also that's bad, that it might put you in danger. So whether you like it or not, you basically need to keep that bridge open, and it is open from the very beginning. And it's not only open, but basically it starts by being dependent upon another open system being open to the environment. Yeah, so it's even more complicated for better and for worse, right? So we are depending on other human bodies from square one. Yeah. And living systems have this, like, going back to the self. Yeah. So they have the self-sustaining property that distinguish them from the inert physical system, and they are typically composed of cells, maintain a stable internal state by moving food into usable energy and grow and reproduce. And this is something I'm going to make a parenthesis right now because I'm coming from Burgundy, and this is the wine region, and we also like food a lot. And we have in Dijon a center, which is an entire research center dedicated to the study of the taste, so the food. And I keep trying to say, people say, well, actually, that's really important because that's the food you put in your body. It's energy. Yeah. So if we are kind of like self-organizing system, we need to be very careful what you basically, take in. Yeah. And it's really, really important to look at some exchanges between, not necessarily wine, but, food and the self-preservation. And that's something, this is one of my dreams. I want to organize a big conference one day in Dijon on, self-preservation and food and energy. And as I said, so that's very much work in progress. So we are happy to hear your feedback and questions, but the basic idea would be that you have the transformation of the cognitive domain of the immune network in an organism ontogeny, are a combination of its recursivity, this is Smith's closure, but it has to be kept a certain pattern, and the fact that it's exposed to random perturbation or fluctuation from the environment, because we are in constant move and we need to adapt and be flexible all the time. So we are open. In other words, it exhibits self-organization, so which means that the transformation of environmental noise into adaptive functional order in a manner similar to many other biological systems such as cells, nervous system, and animal population. And why is this important, and why we start with this and with the basic self and self-preservation, because this is the topic of the project that we are just about to start here in Lisbon. We hired the PhD student and the postdoc. So the postdoc is Dimitris Bolis and the PhD student is Vidushi Patak. We are going to work together on the contrast between, let's say, the self-consciousness and social interaction and humans versus artificial agents. So what I talked to you about today was just in humans, but then the idea is basically to take these ideas that we develop within the human embodiment and human interactive system, and to contrast what we can see with the artificial agents. And this is a project that we have a wonderful team. I'm really, really happy to work with this fabulous people. But the basic idea here is to contrast dyadic social interaction between human and human artificial agents interaction. So different type of embodiment and different type of embodied artificial agents like robots, avatars, and chats, and to look what is the impact of this type of interaction with artificial agents on the human sense of self. And this is important because, well, the future is going to be more and more oriented towards artificial agents. So this means we're going to have to deal with this type of interactions almost on a daily basis. And this is work that is generously funded by the Foundation of Science and Technology here in Portugal. And we're going to start this year with 2 workshops in June. We're going to have Andy Clark. I'm going to post everything on Twitter, don't worry. We're going to start with Andy Clark and Sean Gallagher in June, and then we're going to have a massive conference later on in October here in Lisbon. We're going to have an open call for papers, and I'm going to invite people working on this to, come and present their work and start collaborating with us. We also want to have a cross-cultural component, so to do studies in different cultures. So we are very much open to a collaboration. So don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you're interested in this type of work. Yeah, so I believe you all know this famous scene from the Blade Runner movie. So we want to see whether there's something special about being born, not made. Yeah. So that's going to be an open question, the first stage of the project. And that's it from me. I wanted to thank you for your Zoom attention. And speaking of Zoom, I want to, it's like a shameless self-promotion, but actually also I think it's important as well. So we did a study during the COVID pandemic lockdown on the impact of increased digital interaction, like via Zoom, on people's sense of self. Yeah. And we contrasted basically, as I said, based on this idea that, well, we have static vision mostly, and then dynamic and multisensory. So we contrasted this type of condition with the traits of depersonalization, which means like the traits of people feeling detached from their own self and the body. And the paper will come out very soon, which is like did proofreadings in scientific reports, attractive title is Zoomed Out. So the take-home message be like, don't spend too much time on Zoom and being static, because basically you're going to slowly detach from your own body and self. Actually, we need to have like multisensory interaction with the environment and to be active in the world. And for a very basic reason, if you remember what I said about like the self-regulation, self-preservation, I mean, if I'm in a virtual environment and I see a very nice bottle of water, a very nice glass of wine on a screen, that's fine. But actually what really interests my brain is actually to be able to grasp it and grab it and just like put it in my body, inside my body, because this is what I need to actually make sure that I'm going to survive and get, food and water. And this is why we need to be careful with this type of like digital interactions. So enough from me from Zoom, because I keep saying that the Zoom is not good. So thank you all for having me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.